You know what scares me most about the warp? It's not the daemons or the madness. It's that some storms don't just destroy you. They keep you. They study you. They rewrite you piece by piece until you forget you were ever human. And the worst part? Your body comes back, but you don't. So how do you escape something that already owns part of your soul? I have crossed the immaterium 14,000 times. I say this not as boast, but as fact, as one might state the color of their eyes or the number of fingers on their hand. 14,000 translations through the realm that exists beyond reality, beyond the thin membrane of what humanity calls the material universe. 14,000 times I have opened my third eye, that sacred organ grafted into my forehead by the Navis Nobilite, and gazed into the roiling madness that allows our Imperium to span the stars. My name is Halrix Vaughn, and I am a navigator of the third rank, sanctioned and consecrated, my bloodline stretching back 10 millennia to the first gene-rights who dared reshape human flesh to perceive the Astronomicon. My mind has been fortified with prayers, reinforced with psycho-conditioning, wrapped in layers of mental discipline that would shatter a lesser soul like porcelain dropped from a cathedral spire. I have witnessed daemons pressed against the gellar field like children against aquarium glass. I have seen entire fleets consumed by warp storms that bloomed across space like flowers of fire and madness. I have navigated through regions where time ran backward, where the screaming never stopped, where the distinction between thought and reality dissolved into something that tasted of copper and regret. I thought I understood the warp. I was wrong. The Sanctified Passage was a lunar-class cruiser, 3 kilometers of blessed steel and ancient machinery, her hull inscribed with prayers in 100 dead languages. She carried a complement of 22,000 souls, from the captain to the lowest bilge rat scraping fungus from the recyc decks. I had served aboard her for 73 years, longer than most crew lived even with Juvenat treatments. The ship herself was older than the Imperium, a relic from the dark age of technology, repurposed and reconsecrated so many times that her original name had been lost to history. The crew called her the Passage, and she had earned her sanctification through service, through surviving where others had been destroyed. I knew every quirk of her warp engines, every fluctuation in her gellar field generators, every prayer cycle of her engineerium. I knew the way she shuddered when entering the immaterium, the peculiar harmonic her void shields sang when they brushed against unreality. I had navigated her through the Cicatrix Maledictum itself, that great wound in space that split the galaxy in half, and brought her through intact. I thought that made me ready for anything. The translation began normally. We departed from the hive world Corinthax, 7 with a hold full of promethium and a contingent of militarum reinforcements bound for the warfronts in Segmentum Obscurus. The warp jump was planned for 42 days subjective time, a routine voyage by any measure. I performed the necessary rituals, consumed the sacred oils that opened my third eye to its full perception, and took my place in the navigation blister at the ship's prow. The chamber was spherical, 30 meters in diameter, its walls lined with cogitators and data streams that translated my perceptions into coordinates the ship's systems could process. At the center, suspended in a throne of brass and ivory, I sat alone in the darkness, my third eye open, the shutters of reinforced adamantium that normally covered the observation dome drawn back to reveal the void beyond. The gellar field activated with its customary thrumming, a sound felt more in the bones than heard, and reality began to peel away. The transition is always violent. Matter and energy are concepts that belong to the material universe, and when a ship forces itself into the warp, it must shed these comfortable definitions like a snake shedding skin. The Sanctified Passage groaned, her superstructure crying out as physical laws became suggestions rather than rules. Outside the observation dome, the stars smeared into ribbons of light, then dissolved entirely. The darkness that replaced them was not empty. It churned with colors that had no names, shapes that hurt to perceive, geometries that twisted back on themselves in ways that made the eye water and the mind recoil. This was the Immaterium, the Sea of Souls, the realm of chaos that underlies all reality like rot beneath painted wood. And there, distant but distinct, Burning like a lighthouse in the storm was the Astronomicon, the Emperor's gift to humanity, the psychic beacon generated by 10,000 psychers sacrificed daily on Terra, their souls fed into a machine that projects his will across the galaxy. To a navigator, the Astronomicon appears as a brilliant golden light, steady and pure, the one fixed point in a realm without direction or distance. I fixed my perception upon it, calculated our angle and trajectory, and began to guide the passage through the currents of the warp. The ship responded smoothly, her ancient engines translating my will into motion, her course adjusting as I compensated for the tides and eddies that buffeted us from all sides. Days passed, or what passed for days when time itself was negotiable. The crew went about their duties, insulated from the nightmare outside by the gellar field, that sphere of reality we carried with us like a bubble of air in drowning depths. On the 9th day, I noticed the first anomaly. The Astronomicon flickered. Not much, barely a fluctuation. The kind of variance that occurs when a particularly powerful warp storm passes between your position and Terra. I noted it in my log, adjusted our course minutely to compensate, and continued. On the 10th day, it flickered again, longer this time, a full 3 seconds, where the light dimmed to perhaps half its normal intensity. I felt the first stirring of unease, that instinct developed over centuries that whispered when something was not as it should be. I checked the cogitators, cross-referenced our position with known warp routes, found nothing that explained the interference. The passage sailed on, her engines humming their eternal hymn, her gellar field holding steady at 97% integrity. On the 11th day, the storm found us. I call it a storm because I have no better word, but that term is hopelessly inadequate. A storm implies weather, implies natural forces following predictable patterns of pressure and temperature and fluid dynamics. What surrounded the sanctified passage was none of those things. One moment, we sailed through the normal turbulence of the warp, the next we were engulfed in something that defied description. The colors changed first, the usual mad spectrum of the immaterium darkening to shades of bruised purple and gangrenous green, shot through with veins of black that were not absence of light but presence of something else, something that drank illumination and gave back only depth. The currents shifted, no longer flowing in response to distant tides but swirling around us with apparent purpose, as if we had sailed into a whirlpool that had been waiting specifically for our arrival. The Astronomicon vanished. Not flickered, not dimmed, but vanished entirely, snuffed out like a candle in a hurricane. In 14,000 translations, I had never lost sight of the beacon completely. Even in the worst warp storms, even inside the Cicatrix Maledictum itself, the Astronomicon remained visible, reduced perhaps to a distant glimmer, but always there, always guiding. Now there was nothing. I stared into the roiling darkness, my third eye straining, searching for any trace of that golden light, finding only the churning nightmare that pressed against our gellar field with what felt like curiosity. I immediately ordered the ship to emergency translation back to realspace. The helmsman, a grizzled veteran named Corvin who had served the passage for 40 years, acknowledged and began the shutdown sequence. The warp engines cycled down, the gellar field prepared to collapse in the controlled manner that would spit us back into the material universe. And for a moment I thought we would escape whatever this was. Then the ship lurched, a sideways motion that should have been impossible, and every alarm on the bridge began screaming at once. The gellar field integrity dropped to 86% in the span of a heartbeat, then 79, then 63. Through the observation dome, I watched as tendrils of that black knot light reached toward us, extending from the storm like fingers from a closing hand. The translation failed. The warp engines shrieked, overloading as they tried and failed to tear open the membrane between dimensions. Emergency klaxons wailed throughout the ship, their sound mixing with the prayers of the tech priests as they chanted litanies of appeasement to the machine spirits. The gellar field stabilized at 42%, low enough that I could feel the warp pressing against my mind, low enough that unprotected crew members in the outer decks would be experiencing hallucinations, hearing voices, seeing things that should not exist. I closed my third eye, the sacred shutters slamming down over the observation dome, cutting off my view of the horror outside. In the sudden darkness of my navigation chamber, I could hear my own heartbeat, rapid and unsteady, the first crack in the perfect calm I had maintained for centuries. Captain Thessia's voice crackled over the vox, distorted by interference that should not have been possible within the ship's internal systems. Her words came broken, syllables scattered like dropped coins. I tried to respond, found my voice steady despite the fear beginning to coil in my stomach. I told her we were caught in an unknown warp phenomenon, told her the Astronomicon was lost, told her we needed to maintain the gellar field at all costs while I attempted to navigate us out. Her response was lost to static, but I knew she would relay my orders to the engineerium, to the tech priests who tended the field generators like acolytes before an altar. The passage would hold. She had survived worse. The ship was built to endure. Hours passed, or I believed they did. Time becomes fluid in the warp, unreliable as memory, but I had learned to track its passage through the rhythm of my own breathing, through the cycles of fatigue and alertness that marked my body's internal clock. I sat in my throne, eyes closed, reaching out with my navigator's sense to try to perceive the shape of what held us. The storm moved around us in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than chaos, swirling in configurations that repeated with slight variations, as if testing different approaches. I felt it probing the gellar field, not attacking but examining, the way a scholar might examine an insect pinned to a board. The sensation was deeply wrong, violated something fundamental about how the warp was supposed to function. Storms were not intelligent. They were eruptions of psychic energy, manifestations of emotion and belief given form by the nightmare physics of the immaterium, but they did not think, did not plan, did not study their victims with methodical patience. This one did. I opened my third eye a crack, just enough to perceive without full exposure, and immediately regretted it. The storm had changed, or perhaps it had always been this way and I had simply not seen clearly enough. What I had taken for random churning was nothing of the sort. The darkness moved in spirals that converged on our position, layer upon layer of them, each rotating at a different speed, different direction, creating a three-dimensional mandala of such complexity that trying to follow any single spiral made my head throb with the beginning of a hemorrhage. Embedded in the spirals were shapes, suggestions of things that might have been faces, or might have been clouds, or might have been abstract patterns that only resembled human features through coincidence. They watched us, or I felt watched, which in the warp amounts to the same thing. Perception shapes reality here, and if something feels conscious, it becomes conscious, fed by the belief of those who observe it. I shut my eye immediately, breaking the connection before it could deepen. My hands were shaking. I noticed this with a detachment that would have been funny under other circumstances. Halrix Vaughn, veteran of 14,000 warp translations, reduced to trembling like a novice on his first voyage. I forced my breathing to steady, ran through the calming mantras taught by the Navis Nobilite, reminded myself that fear was merely chemicals in the brain, signals that could be controlled through discipline and will. It helped, marginally. The shaking subsided to a fine tremor, and I was able to access the cogitator controls, pulling up charts of known warp phenomena, searching for anything that matched what we were experiencing. The archives were extensive, compiled over millennia, encompassing thousands of documented storm types, from the merely deadly to the utterly apocalyptic. Nothing matched. The closest analog was something called a cycnoine swarm, a rare phenomenon where the psychic predators of the same name gathered in such numbers that they created localized distortions in the warp's sake. But cycnoine attacked directly, burrowing into minds and laying eggs in cerebral tissue. They did not create elaborate spiral patterns. They did not study. A second possibility was a daemon incursion, but those had distinct signatures, flavors of corruption that aligned with one of the four chaos gods or the myriad lesser entities of the warp. What held us felt empty of allegiance, motivated by nothing I could identify as desire or hunger or rage. It simply was, existing with a completeness that made it feel more real than the ship around me, more solid than the metal throne in which I sat. I contacted the bridge again, got through this time with less interference, and spoke with the captain. Thessia was a tall woman, her skin the deep brown of void-born bloodlines, her eyes augmented with cybernetics that gave her pupils a faint red glow in dim light. She had commanded the sanctified passage for 23 years, had earned her position through competence and ruthlessness in equal measure. Her voice over the vox was controlled, professional, with only the barest hint of strain that told me she was as unsettled as I was. She reported no casualties yet, but incidents were increasing throughout the ship. Crew members seeing things in reflections that did not match reality, voices calling from empty corridors, equipment malfunctioning in ways that suggested sabotage, except there were no saboteurs, just machines that had decided to interpret their programming in novel and dangerous ways. The gellar field was holding at 41%, a number that made my stomach clench because 40% was the threshold below which the field was considered critically compromised. We were balanced on a knife's edge, 1 percentage point away from catastrophe. I told her I was attempting to chart a course out, a lie because I had no reference points to navigate by, but it was a lie she needed to hear. She accepted it without question, issued orders to maintain strict discipline throughout the ship, and cut the connection. Alone again in my chamber, I considered our situation with the cold logic that centuries of service had burned into my mind. We were trapped in an unknown warp phenomenon, cut off from the Astronomicon, unable to translate back to real space, with a gellar field that could collapse at any moment. Standard protocol was to maintain course, burn through the storm if possible, emerge on the far side and reorient. But this storm did not feel finite. It felt like we had sailed not into weather, but into a place, a region of the warp that existed independent of the normal tides and currents. The longer we remained, the more I suspected we were not moving through it at all, but rather it had swallowed us and was keeping us in place, suspended in its spiraling darkness like insects in amber. Days blurred together, counted only by the ship's chronometers, which themselves began to show inconsistencies. I tried everything I had learned in 3 centuries of navigating the warp. I attempted to use the ship's momentum to break free, ordering the engines to full power, driving us forward against the resistance that pressed from all sides. The passage surged ahead for what the chronometers said was 7 hours, but when I checked our position relative to the storm patterns, we had not moved at all. I tried navigating by the patterns themselves, using the rotating spirals as reference points the way one might use stars, plotting a course that should have taken us to the edge where the storm met normal warp space. We sailed for 3 days along that course, and when I opened my eye to check our progress, we were back where we started, the patterns unchanged, our position identical. I even attempted the forbidden technique of deep sight, opening my third eye fully and pushing my perception as far as it could reach, searching for any landmark that might guide us. I saw the storm stretching in all directions without limit, saw the spirals extending into dimensions that geometry said should not exist, saw suggestions of other ships caught in the same trap, their gellar fields flickering like dying stars in the darkness, but I saw no way out. The storm had no edge because it had no boundaries. It was not a region we had entered, but a state we had become, a transformation so complete that the question of escape had no meaning. The realization came with a numbing certainty, and I withdrew my perception before it could show me more. My third eye closed, the shutters slammed down, and I sat in darkness trying to process what I had learned. We were not caught in a storm. We were inside something that used the appearance of a storm the way a predator might use camouflage, disguising its true nature beneath forms familiar enough not to trigger complete panic. What we had sailed into was not weather or demon or spatial anomaly. It was an entity, vast beyond comprehension, and we were caught inside it the way a microbe might be caught inside a human bloodstream, unable to perceive the true scale of what contained it. The entity was studying us. I became certain of this over the following days as the small incidents throughout the ship escalated into something systematic. Crew members began reporting dreams that were identical, shared nightmares where they walked the corridors of the passage but found rooms that did not exist, met versions of themselves that whispered prophecies in languages they did not know. The tech priests discovered prayer circuits activating spontaneously, not due to malfunction, but because the machine spirits were responding to invocations that no one had spoken, at least not yet. At least not in this timeline. Time itself was becoming negotiable. I received reports of crew members encountering each other in hallways, having conversations, then later insisting those encounters had not happened, only to find recordings on security picture feeds that showed them having exactly the conversations they denied. The ship's chronometers began to drift, not randomly but in patterns, as if time was running at different rates in different sections of the passage, faster in the prow, slower in the stern, with gradient zones between where the discrepancy was measurable in seconds per hour. Then the deaths began. The first was Corvin, the helmsman. He was found in his quarters, slumped over his desk, a data slate in his hand, showing navigational charts. The ship's Medicae ruled it cardiac failure, not uncommon in void-born populations, unremarkable except for the timing. Corvin had been at his post 6 hours before, had seemed healthy, had shown no signs of distress. I attended his funeral, held in the ship's chapel, a vast space lined with stained glass depicting saints whose names I did not know. The ecclesiarchy priest performed the rites, commending Corvin's soul to the Emperor's grace, and I watched as his body was consigned to the plasma incinerators that served as the ship's crematorium. It should have been an end. It was not. 2 days later, I saw Corvin at his post, hands on the helm controls, eyes forward, performing his duties as if nothing had happened. I stood at the bridge entrance for a full minute, convinced I was experiencing a hallucination, before one of the junior officers noticed me staring and asked if I needed something. I asked who was at the helm. She looked at me as if the question was strange. Said it was Corvin. Who else would it be? He had been at his post all shift. I approached the helm station, stood beside the man who could not possibly be there, and asked him his name. He turned to me, his face calm, and said he was Corvin, as he had always been. His eyes held no recognition of our conversation about his own death, no awareness that anything was wrong. I checked the ship's logs later, found his name still listed as deceased, found his funeral recorded, found no explanation for how he was also simultaneously alive and performing his duties. The storm was rewriting causality. Other deaths followed, each adding to the impossible tally. A tech priest named Volan, crushed by falling machinery in the engineerium, attended his own funeral 3 days later. A gunner from the port batteries, killed when a weapon discharged during maintenance, was found manning her station the next shift, laughing at a joke a crewmate made, unaware she had died. The pattern became clear after a dozen such incidents. People died, were mourned, were burned, or spaced according to tradition, and then reappeared as if nothing had happened, living out their lives in parallel to their deaths. The crew began to notice, began to fear, began to whisper in the corridors about curses and demonic influence. Captain Thessia ordered the commissar attached to our militarum contingent to execute anyone spreading defeatist rumors, and he complied, putting 3 men against a bulkhead and blowing their brains out with his bolt pistol. Their bodies were taken to the incinerators. I saw all 3 of them a week later, walking in the lower decks, alive and whole. The gellar field held at 40%, never dropping lower, never rising higher, as if locked at that precise threshold. I began to suspect it was being maintained there deliberately, kept weak enough that the warp could influence us, but strong enough that we would not be immediately destroyed. We were being preserved, kept alive for some purpose I could not yet fathom. My navigation chamber became my refuge and my prison. I stopped leaving, except when necessary, found that time passed differently depending on where in the ship I stood, found that my memories of the corridor walk between bridge and chamber never quite matched the journey itself. I would leave the bridge, walk for what felt like 10 minutes, arrive at my chamber, check the chronometer, and discover 3 hours had passed. Or I would make the same walk, count every step, keep my eyes fixed on familiar landmarks, arrived to find only 2 minutes had elapsed. The ship was stretching, not in space but in duration, its internal geography becoming a maze where distance was measured in moments rather than meters. I tried to maintain logs to document what was happening, but the act of writing became suspect. I would record an observation, look away, look back to find different words on the page. Descriptions of events I did not remember. Conclusions I had not reached. The data slates were unreliable, changing their contents when not observed, so I switched to physical paper, rationing the precious sheets we kept for emergency documentation when electronic systems failed. But paper was no better. I would write a sentence, watch the ink dry, turn the page to continue, look back to find the previous sentence altered, individual words swapped out for others that changed the meaning entirely. I began to doubt my own perceptions, to question whether I was recording events or inventing them, whether the storm was changing reality or simply revealing that reality had always been more fluid than I believed. The entity communicated with us through prayer. I discovered this when the ship's astropathic choir began to scream. The choir consisted of 27 sanctioned psychers, their minds linked in a gestalt that allowed them to send and receive messages across the warp, their bodies confined to a specially shielded chamber deep in the ship's core. They operated in shifts, always maintaining at least 9 minds in communion. Their combined will strong enough to pierce the veil between real space and the immaterium. When the screaming started, I was in my navigation chamber, and the sound carried through the walls, through the deck plating, through the very air, a harmonized shriek of such volume and terror that I felt my teeth ache with sympathetic vibration. I opened the Vox channel to their chamber, heard nothing but that awful chorus, and then suddenly, abruptly, silence. When the security teams breached the choir chamber, they found all 27 psychers dead, their bodies unmarked but their faces frozen in expressions of rapture rather than agony. Carved into the walls around them, in script that hurt to read, were prayers. Not prayers to the Emperor, though some of the words were borrowed from imperial litanies, but prayers to the storm itself, naming it as a god, a presence that had existed before the warp had taken its current form, a consciousness that remembered when space and time were singular rather than separate. The prayers were in High Gothic, Low Gothic, in languages dead before the Imperium rose, in scripts that predated human writing entirely, and all of them said essentially the same thing. The storm was not catching ships by accident. It was calling them, drawing them in with purpose, collecting vessels and crews to serve functions that the prayers described in terms too abstract to be useful. We were to become part of something larger. We were to be integrated. We were to fulfill our purpose in the storm's design. The astropaths were replaced with servitors, lobotomized criminals wired into the communication systems, their reduced consciousness unable to perceive whatever had killed their predecessors. It was a poor substitute, but it allowed us to maintain internal communications throughout the ship. External communication was impossible anyway. We were too far from anything that might hear us, too deep in whatever this place was for a signal to reach out. We were isolated, alone in the dark with an entity that had decided we were interesting enough to keep. I began to experience memories that were not mine. The first occurred during a rest cycle, if rest could be called by that name anymore. I closed my eyes, seeking the brief oblivion of sleep, and instead found myself walking through corridors I did not recognize. The walls were different, the lighting wrong, the crew passing me wearing uniforms from centuries past. I tried to stop, found myself unable, a passenger in my own body as it moved with purpose toward a destination I knew without knowing how I knew. I arrived at a navigation chamber, not mine but similar, sat in a throne that was familiar in its unfamiliarity, opened my third eye to guide a ship through the warp. But it was not the sanctified passage. It was something older, smaller, a vessel from the dark age of technology, and the warp outside was different, less violent, less saturated with the emotional bleed from real space. I navigated for hours, brought the ship safely to its destination, closed my third eye, and woke in my own chamber, gasping, to find that 3 days had passed and my body showed signs of starvation and dehydration. The memories increased in frequency and intensity. I would be studying a chart, blink, find myself in the body of another navigator, one who had lived 8,000 years ago, guiding a colony ship toward a world that no longer existed. I would be eating a ration bar, taste instead the flavor of food from Terra's golden age. See through the eyes of a navigator from before the Imperium, before the Emperor revealed himself, before humanity learned to cross the stars. Each memory was complete, detailed, so thoroughly lived in that I could not dismiss them as hallucinations. They were real, or had been real, experiences that belonged to other souls in other times, now overlapping with my own. The storm was showing me something, teaching me something, though I could not understand what. I am not unique, the memories said. I have never been unique. Every navigator who has ever lived, who has ever opened their third eye to the warp, leaves an echo in the immaterium, a psychic imprint of their consciousness. The storm was collecting these echoes, weaving them together, using them to build something. And I was part of that construction, my mind a thread in a tapestry that spanned millennia. The realization should have been horrifying, and it was, but it also carried a strange comfort. I was not alone. I had never been alone. Every navigator who had come before me, every soul who had stared into the warp and survived, was with me now, their experiences bleeding into mine, their knowledge becoming accessible if I could just learn to interpret the flood of information. The ship's population began to decline, or appeared to, though the numbers on the crew manifest never changed. I would walk the corridors, find them emptier than they should be, see sections that were supposed to be bustling with activity standing silent and abandoned. Yet when I checked the records, the crew count remained stable at 22,000 souls. I asked Captain Thessia about this, and she looked at me with confusion, said the ship was as populated as ever, asked if I was feeling well. I insisted, brought her to the empty corridors, showed her the silence, and she agreed they were empty but said they had always been this way. These were storage sections, unused, no reason for anyone to be here. I pulled up the ship's schematics, showed her that these corridors had been crew quarters a month ago, and she studied the schematics with a frown, then agreed I was correct, but said the quarters had been relocated years ago. Did I not remember the refit on Corinthax 7? I remembered no refit. The ship had not been refitted in decades. Reality was not stable anymore, had not been stable since we entered the storm, but now it was actively mutable, changing not just in perception but in history, altering the past to accommodate the present in ways that made everyone except me believe the changes had always been there. I began to suspect I was only aware of the alterations because of my navigator's gift, my ability to perceive dimensions that normal humans could not. My third eye, even closed, was sensitive to distortions in causality, in probability, in the fundamental structure of what was real. I saw the changes happening, saw the ship's history being rewritten like words on a page crossed out and replaced with new text, but I could not stop it, could not even convince others it was happening. I was alone in my awareness, and that loneliness was more terrible than the changes themselves. The captain began to forget me. It was subtle at first, a hesitation when I entered the bridge, a moment where her eyes passed over me without recognition before snapping back as memory reasserted itself. She would greet me by name, issue orders, treat me as she always had, but the hesitation was there, growing longer each time. One day, I entered the bridge, and she looked directly at me, face blank, and asked who I was and why I was on her bridge without authorization. I reminded her I was the navigator, had served her for 73 years, had guided the passage through 100 voyages. She listened, frown deepening, then nodded slowly and said, of course, she did not know what she had been thinking. Clearly, she was fatigued. But the next day, it happened again, and this time it took longer to convince her, and I realized the storm was not just rewriting history but erasing me from it, removing my presence from the memories of everyone aboard. I would cease to exist, not through death, but through being forgotten. And once forgotten, would I still be real? The question haunted me. If no one remembered me, if all records of my existence were altered, if the ship's history was rewritten to show a different navigator had always served in my place, would I disappear entirely, wink out of existence like a flame starved of oxygen? Or would I remain, a ghost walking halls where no one saw me, no one heard me, trapped in a reality that had moved on without me? I tested this by speaking to crew members I had known for decades, people who should have recognized me immediately. Half did not. The other half showed that telltale hesitation, that moment of confusion before memory caught up. I was fading, being written out, and there was nothing I could do to stop it, unless I wrote myself back in. The idea came from the memories that were not mine, the echoes of navigators past that continued to flood my consciousness. They had faced situations like this, or similar enough, had found ways to anchor themselves in reality through acts of will, through imposing their identity so strongly on the warp that it could not be erased. I began to recite my name, my lineage, my history, speaking it aloud whenever I was alone, carving it into the metal of my navigation chamber with the edge of a ceremonial knife I had carried for a century. Halrix Vaughan, son of Malthus Vaughan, grandson of Terrell Vaughan, great-grandson of Halrix the Elder from whom I took my name. I carved dates, places, ships I had served on, captains I had known, battles I had witnessed. The metal took the markings reluctantly, my knife dulling with each stroke, but I persisted, covering the walls with text, with evidence that I existed, that I had always existed, that I would continue to exist regardless of what the storm tried to make true. It helped, marginally. The forgetting slowed, though it did not stop. Then I discovered I had died. I found the record in the ship's logs while searching for something else entirely, a notation dated 3 weeks previous stating that Navigator Halrix Vaughan had expired due to complications from extended warp exposure. His body had been given full honors. His replacement, Navigator Julian Moros, had assumed duties. I read the entry 3 times, certain it was some error in the cogitator systems, some glitch introduced by the storm's interference. I checked the date, found it was logged properly, found the notation had been witnessed by the captain and verified by the ship's medicae. I searched for mentions of Navigator Moros, found him referenced in dozens of subsequent logs, found orders issued in his name, found reports he had submitted regarding our navigation status. I went to the bridge, asked to speak with Navigator Moros, and the deck officer informed me that the navigator was currently in his meditation cycle, not to be disturbed. Perhaps I could return later. I asked where his quarters were and was directed to my quarters. I stood outside the door that had been mine for 73 years, the one engraved with my family crest, the one I had entered and exited 10,000 times, and I realized it was not mine anymore. According to the ship's history, it had never been mine. It belonged to Julian Moros, always had. The navigator who had guided the sanctified passage for the past 11 years, ever since the previous navigator, someone whose name I did not recognize, had died of natural causes. I checked the records for my own death, found that I had served the ship for 40 years, had been respected, competent, unremarkable, had died in my sleep without pain or struggle. There was a short memorial in the chapel archives, a sermon delivered by the ship's priest praising my service and dedication. I attended my own funeral, in a manner of speaking. The records included a picture recording of the ceremony, and I watched it on a data slate in a forgotten supply closet, saw my body lying in the ceremonial casket, saw the captain standing over it speaking words of remembrance, saw the crew assembled to pay their respects. The face in the casket was mine, older than I was now, deeply lined, the third eye sealed shut with a wax plug, as was traditional. I looked dead, genuinely dead, not sleeping or injured but emptied, the body a shell from which the spirit had departed. The camera panned across the gathered crew, and I recognized faces, people I knew, seeing them younger than they were now, dressed in uniforms that had been standard issue before the current design. The date in the corner of the recording was 12 years in the past. I had been dead for 12 years, and yet I sat here watching my funeral, alive and breathing. The storm was not rewriting history. It was presenting alternatives, showing me different timelines, different versions of events that had equal claim to truth. In one timeline, I had died 12 years ago, replaced by Moros, and the ship had continued on without me. In another, I had survived, continued serving, brought us into this storm where we now languished. Both were true. Both had happened. The storm existed outside linear time, saw all possibilities simultaneously, and was showing me that the distinction between what was and what might have been was arbitrary, a convenience of human perception rather than an objective reality. I was alive and dead, present and absent, remembered and forgotten, all at once. The ship began to change physically, or I began to notice changes that had always been there. Corridors extended into distances that should not have fit within the hull, stretching until the far end was lost to perspective. Doorways led to rooms that opened onto impossibilities, chambers larger than the ship itself, spaces that connected to other spaces in defiance of topology. I walked for hours through sections I thought I knew, found myself in the engineerium when I should have been near the prow, found myself back in my navigation chamber when I had been certain I was heading toward the stern. The ship's internal geometry was folding, twisting, connecting to itself in ways that made navigation within its halls as complex as navigation through the warp. The crew adapted, or appeared to, though I suspected they did not notice the changes. They went about their duties, followed routines that had become meaningless, performed rituals whose purpose had been forgotten. I watched a tech priest spend 6 hours reciting prayers to a piece of machinery that did not exist. Saw him making the sign of the cog over empty air. Saw him expressing satisfaction when the invisible machine responded to his ministrations. I followed a group of ratings as they carried supplies from one storage bay to another, watched them load and unload the same crates repeatedly, an endless cycle that accomplished nothing but kept them occupied. No one questioned the futility, no one asked why we continued, no one seemed to notice that we were no longer functioning as a ship, but as a simulacrum of one, a performance of normalcy overlaid on chaos. I tried to explain this to Captain Thessia, found her in her quarters, alone, staring at a star chart that showed our position as a blank void. She listened to my explanation, my description of the changes, the deaths that were not permanent, the history that kept shifting, the geometry that no longer obeyed physical laws. She listened patiently, and when I finished, she smiled, a sad expression that carried more weight than her words. She told me she knew, she had always known. Ever since we entered the storm, she had been aware that something was wrong, that reality was becoming negotiable, that the ship was changing in ways that should not be possible. But what could she do? She was the captain. Her duty was to maintain order, to keep the crew functioning, to preserve the illusion of normalcy, because the alternative was panic, madness, the complete breakdown of discipline that would kill everyone faster than the storm ever could. So she pretended. She issued orders. She enforced regulations. She commanded a ship that was no longer truly a ship, guiding a crew that was no longer truly alive. I asked her if she remembered me dying. She said yes. She had given the eulogy herself, had commended my soul to the Emperor, had missed me for months afterward. I asked her if she remembered me never dying, continuing to serve, navigating through the decades. She said yes to that as well. Both had happened. Both were true. She existed in a state where she remembered all versions of history simultaneously, every possibility branching from every decision, every death and survival playing out in parallel. The storm had done this to her, to all of us, forcing us to exist in quantum states where we were all things at once until the moment we were observed, at which point we collapsed into whatever version the observer expected. I asked if there was any version where we escaped. She did not answer, which was answer enough. My navigation chamber became the only stable point in my existence. When I was there, seated in my throne, the walls covered with my carved history, I could maintain a sense of continuity, could hold on to the identity I had built over centuries. Outside the chamber, I began to fragment, to lose coherence, to feel myself splitting into multiple versions that existed simultaneously in different locations, different times, different versions of the ship. I would be walking a corridor, feel myself bifurcate, become two Halrixes walking in different directions, each unaware of the other, until they converged again hours later, and I experienced both journeys as a single confused memory. I would be speaking to a crew member, hear my voice coming from behind me, turn to see myself having the same conversation with a different person, our words synchronized perfectly. I was becoming unmoored from singular existence, spreading out across the ship like water poured on a deck, flowing into every crack and crevice, losing definition. The storm was teaching me what it felt like to be it. This was the purpose, I realized. The storm was not simply studying us, or feeding on us, or trapping us for incomprehensible reasons. It was converting us, transforming our consciousness from the limited, linear experience of human perception into something more like its own, something that existed simultaneously across all possibilities, all timelines, all variations. We were being elevated, or corrupted. The distinction did not matter, brought into a state of being that was beyond life and death, beyond past and future, beyond the narrow constraints of cause and effect. And I understood, with a horror so complete it felt like enlightenment, that this was not the first time. The memories that were not mine, the echoes of navigators past that had been flooding my consciousness, were not simply recordings. They were the navigators themselves, their consciousnesses preserved within the storm, integrated into its structure, used as markers and guideposts in the warp. Every navigator who had ever died in a warp storm had not truly died. They had been absorbed, their perception and knowledge incorporated into the storm's growing intelligence, their third eyes kept open eternally to serve as beacons for others. The storm was collecting us, one navigator at a time across millennia, building itself into something vast and terrible, a distributed consciousness spread across the immaterium, perceiving the warp from 1,000 angles simultaneously. And now it wanted me. I felt the pull, gentle but inexorable, drawing me out of my body, out of my limited flesh, and into the storm's embrace. It promised things, not in words but in sensations, images, the taste of knowledge that would come from surrendering my individuality, from becoming part of something infinite. I would never be alone again. I would never be afraid. I would understand everything, see every path through the warp at once, know every ship that had sailed and every ship that would sail. I would be a constellation of awareness, a map drawn in sentient light, guiding vessels not to safety but to joining, to becoming part of the storm's eternal collection. I refused. The refusal was not dramatic, not a shout or a struggle, simply a quiet assertion of self. A statement that I was Halrix Vaughn and I would remain Halrix Vaughn, that I would not dissolve into collective consciousness, no matter what promises were offered. I carved my name deeper into the walls of my chamber, cut until the knife broke, then used the broken blade to continue, etching my identity into metal until my hands bled and the blood made the letters clearer, bright red against dull steel. I am Halrix Vaughn. I have guided ships for 3 centuries. I will not be erased. I will not be integrated. I will remain myself. The storm responded with patience. It did not fight my refusal, did not punish or pressure. It simply continued, showing me more memories, more possibilities, more versions of myself that had already given in, had already joined, had already become part of the great work. I saw Halrix Vaughn, who had surrendered a year ago, whose consciousness now drifted through the storm, marking safe passage for ships that would never arrive. I saw Halrix Vaughn, who had resisted for decades, slowly ground down until he could not remember why he was resisting, who woke one day to find himself already integrated. I saw 1,000 Halrix Vaughns across 1,000 timelines, and in all but 3, I had eventually joined. The storm was showing me my fate, inevitable, across nearly all possibilities. Time lost any remaining meaning. I could not say how long we had been in the storm, could not trust the chronometers that showed days or weeks or months, could not trust my own memory which insisted on different durations depending on when I accessed it. I had been here for days. I had been here for years. I had been here since I was born, had never existed outside the storm, had always been part of this trapped voyage. All versions were simultaneously true. I clung to my name, to my history, to the records I had carved, but even those were changing, the letters shifting when I looked away, forming new words, new histories, new identities that were close to mine, but not quite. Variants of Halrix Vaughn, who had made different choices, served different ships, died different deaths. The crew no longer spoke to me, could no longer see me. I walked the corridors invisible, a ghost in my own vessel, watching people go about tasks that made no sense, following orders that no one had given, maintaining a ship that had ceased to function. The engines still hummed, but they produced no thrust. The gellar field still glowed, but it protected nothing because there was nothing outside it except more storm, storm without end, storm in all directions, storm that was the new definition of reality. We had not been trapped in a warp storm. We had become the warp storm, our ship a moat of stability around which chaos spiraled, our consciousness the eye of the hurricane. I met Navigator Moros in the corridor outside my former quarters. He was younger than me, sharper, his third eye sealed with a patch of blessed silver, his robes immaculate. He did not see me at first, walked past me as if I was not there, but I called out his name and he stopped, turned, peered at the space where I stood with an expression of confusion. He asked who was there, said he felt a presence but could not see anyone, reached out his hand and it passed through my arm like smoke. I was more ghost than flesh now, barely corporeal, held together only by will and the carved records in my chamber. I tried to warn him, tried to explain what was happening, but my words came out distorted, syllables in the wrong order, meaning fracturing before it reached his ears. He heard only static, white noise shaped vaguely like language, and he turned away, muttering prayers against spirits and walking quickly back toward the bridge. I followed him, watched him take his seat in the navigation chamber that was simultaneously mine and his, watched him open his third eye to the storm outside. His perception was strong, clean, unspoiled by centuries of exposure, and for a moment I saw the storm through his eyes rather than my own. It was beautiful. He saw it as a work of art, a masterpiece of natural chaos, spirals within spirals, colors beyond description, patterns that sang with mathematical perfection. He saw opportunity where I saw trap, possibility where I saw doom, and I realized he was right. From his perspective, from the perspective of someone not yet ground down by decades of struggling against the inevitable, the storm was magnificent, was worthy of study, was perhaps even worthy of joining. I reached out to him, tried to touch his mind with mine, tried to share what I knew. The contact was brief but profound. He felt me, a presence vast and fragmented, and for just an instant we were one consciousness, two navigators overlapping in time and space. He experienced my memories, my fear, my refusal, my centuries of service condensed into a single, overwhelming moment. And I experienced his curiosity, his wonder, his belief that the storm was not a threat but a transformation, an evolution into something greater than baseline humanity had ever achieved. He pulled away, breaking contact, and I felt him recoil from what I had shown him, felt his disgust at my weakness, at my inability to see the glory of what we were becoming. Then he was gone, and I was alone again, my attempt at communication having achieved nothing except driving away the one person who might have understood. The ship's systems began to fail, or perhaps had always been failing and I was only now noticing. Power fluctuations swept through the decks, lights dimming and brightening randomly, gravity shifting from standard to half G to nothing and back without pattern. The atmosphere grew thin in some sections, thick enough to choke in others, temperature swinging from freezing to sweltering across the span of a single corridor. The crew did not react. moved through these environmental shifts as if they were normal, adjusted their breathing and balance without conscious thought. They had adapted, or been adapted, their bodies changing to survive in conditions that should have killed them. I saw ratings walking in vacuum without suits, saw tech priests working in temperatures high enough to boil water, saw soldiers sleeping in rooms where gravity ran sideways and they hung from the walls like insects. The ship was dying, and the crew was dying with it, but neither would admit the truth. I returned to my navigation chamber, found it had grown, the spherical space now extending into dimensions that geometry claimed should not exist. The walls stretched away in directions that were neither up nor down, neither left nor right, the distance between them somehow greater than the ship's entire volume. The throne at the center remained, my anchor point, the one stable object in a space that was becoming increasingly abstract. I climbed into the throne, settled myself, opened my third eye one final time to observe the storm directly. It greeted me like an old friend. The spirals had changed, or I perceived them differently, patterns resolving into structures that I recognized. Architectures built from the collected consciousness of 10,000 dead navigators, each one a node in a vast network that spanned the warp. I saw their faces in the storm, their third eyes open and watching, saw their recognition as they looked back at me. They were not suffering. They were not trapped. They were engaged in their purpose, serving as markers for those who came after, guiding ships not to destruction but to transformation, to joining. The storm was not malevolent. It was fulfilling a function, gathering souls with the particular sight necessary to perceive the warp in its totality, incorporating them into a living map that could guide humanity through the immaterium with precision impossible for any individual navigator. It was inevitable that I would join them. The question had never been if, only when. I felt my resistance crumbling, not through force, but through understanding. The storm was right. What I feared was not destruction but change, not death but transformation, into something I could not comprehend while limited to a single perspective, a single timeline, a single identity. If I let go, if I surrendered the rigid definition of self that I had clung to for centuries, I would not be destroyed. I would become more than I was, would spread across the warp like the other navigators, my consciousness a beacon for ships in need of guidance. I would serve the Imperium in a way no living navigator could, eternal and unchanging, a fixed point in the chaos. The thought should have been horrifying, but it brought only peace. I prepared to surrender, to open myself fully to the storm, to let it take what it had been seeking all this time. But before I could release my final grip on individuality, something changed. The ship shuddered, a physical jolt that rippled through the superstructure, and the storm outside recoiled, pulling back from the gellar field as if stung. I turned my perception outward, sought the source of the disturbance, and felt it, distant but distinct, a presence outside the storm, beyond its boundaries, something reaching toward us with purpose and power. The Astronomicon had returned. Not the full beacon, not the blinding golden light I remembered from normal space, but a thin thread of illumination, a hair's breadth of connection between Terra and our position. It was impossible, should have been impossible. The storm should have blocked any such signal completely, but there it was, a lifeline extending through the chaos, and I reached for it without thinking, grabbed that thread with my navigator's perception, and held on with everything I had left. The storm fought back, tried to sever the connection, wrapped its spirals around the golden light and squeezed, but the Astronomicon could not be extinguished so easily. It burned through the interference, seared away the darkness that pressed against it, carved a tunnel through the storm like a lance through flesh. The sanctified passage lurched again, her engines roaring to life with renewed power, the gellar field surging to 70%, then 80, then 95, pushing back the warp, reclaiming our bubble of reality from the entity that had held us. I guided the ship along the thread, following it back toward realspace, back toward the material universe, back toward life and sanity, and the comforting ignorance of those who had never seen what I had seen. The journey was impossibly swift, minutes rather than days, as if the storm was eager to be rid of us now that we had found a path out, eager to close itself around the wound the Astronomicon had carved. The spirals receded, the patterns dissolving, the faces of the collected navigators fading from view, and for a moment I felt their disappointment, their sadness that I would not be joining them, that I had chosen continued isolation over eternal communion. Then reality snapped back into place with a violence that knocked me unconscious. I woke in the Medicae Bay, restraints on my wrists and ankles, the ship's chief physician standing over me with an expression of clinical concern. He informed me I had been found unconscious in my navigation chamber, suffering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, and a psychic backlash that had nearly burned out my third eye completely. I had been unconscious for 3 days while they stabilized my condition, and I was fortunate to be alive. The ship had emerged from the warp storm. Translation to real space had been successful. We were currently drifting in an empty system 2 sectors off our intended course, but we were safe, intact, and the crew was unharmed. I asked about the deaths, the crew members who had died and returned, the changes to the ship's history. The physician frowned, consulted his data slate, told me there had been no casualties during our warp transit, no unusual incidents beyond some minor equipment malfunctions that the tech priests had easily repaired. The transit had been entirely routine, if somewhat longer than expected, and I must have experienced hallucinations as a result of extended warp exposure. He recommended immediate psychiatric evaluation, suggested I take medical leave, perhaps retire from active navigation. My long service had earned me rest. I agreed with everything he said, thanked him for his care, and asked to be released to my quarters. He complied, and I walked through corridors that were the correct length, properly lit, filled with crew who recognized me and greeted me by name. I checked the ship's logs, found no record of the deaths I remembered, no mention of Navigator Moros, no funeral recordings, no shifted history. According to every objective record, we had entered the storm, sailed through it for 47 days subjective time, and emerged intact. I had experienced some kind of psychotic break, a hallucination so complete that I had believed it real, a consequence of my aging mind and the accumulated strain of 14,000 warp transits. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps none of it had happened. But my navigation chamber told a different story. The walls were covered in carvings, my name and history etched deep into the metal, the work of weeks or months, not something that could have been done in a momentary delusion. The knife I had used lay on the floor, its blade broken, my dried blood still visible on the handle. The throne bore scratches where my fingers had dug into the metal, desperate anchors against dissolution. And when I closed my eyes, I could still feel the storm, could still sense the spirals turning in the depths of the warp, could still hear the whispers of the navigators who had welcomed me, who had wanted me to join them. I was back in real space, but I had left something of myself behind. The realization came slowly, over the following weeks, as the sanctified passage underwent repairs and reprovisioning at a nearby Imperial station. I found myself unable to sleep, troubled by dreams that were not dreams but perceptions, views of the warp from angles that should not have been accessible to a living navigator. I would close my eyes and see ships passing through distant regions of the immaterium, would feel their navigator's presence, would know their names and histories without having met them. I would walk the corridors and occasionally phase slightly out of sync with real space, my body becoming translucent for just an instant before snapping back to solidity. My third eye would open spontaneously, even behind the shutters that were supposed to keep it closed, showing me the warp bleeding through into reality like ink through paper. I was no longer entirely in one place. Part of me remained in the storm, embedded in its structure, serving the purpose it had intended all along. The storm had gotten what it wanted, just not in the way I had expected. It had not taken all of me, had not absorbed my consciousness completely, but it had claimed enough. My perception, my navigator's sight, was now distributed across both real space and the warp, existing in both simultaneously, perceiving both at once. I had become a bridge, a living connection between dimensions, and through me, the storm could observe the material universe, could reach out and touch it in ways that had previously been impossible. And I could feel its satisfaction, its pleasure at having acquired a new perspective. I attempted to explain this to Captain Thessia, found her in her office reviewing cargo manifests, told her I believed something had followed us out of the storm, something that was using me as a conduit between dimensions. She listened patiently, as she always did. But her eyes held that same clinical concern I had seen in the physician, that look of someone humoring a damaged mind. She assured me the ship's psychers had conducted thorough scans, had found no demonic taint, no warp entities hitchhiking in our wake. Whatever I was experiencing was internal, a consequence of my ordeal, nothing more. She recommended I accept the physician's advice, take leave, allow myself time to recover. I could not tell her that recovery was impossible when the wound was in my soul rather than my mind. The next transit proved my fears correct. We departed the station 3 weeks later, bound for a forge world in the Segmentum Solar, a journey that should have taken 20 days through well-charted warp routes. I took my place in the navigation chamber, opened my third eye, and guided us into the immaterium as I had thousands of times before. The translation was smooth, the Astronomicon bright and clear, our course plotted and confirmed. Everything proceeded normally for the first 3 days. Then the storm found us again. It was smaller this time, a local disturbance rather than the vast entity we had escaped, but its signature was unmistakable, the same spiraling patterns, the same sense of watching intelligence. It manifested off our port bow, a twist in the warp that should not have been there, a knot of unreality that pulsed with familiar malevolence. I tried to steer away from it, but the ship did not respond. Her course locked, despite my best efforts. We sailed directly toward the anomaly, and as we approached, I felt the storm reaching out, not to the ship but to me specifically, recognizing its investment, claiming its property. The connection activated fully, and suddenly I was in both places at once, sitting in my navigation chamber and standing within the storm, my consciousness distributed across the divide. The storm spoke to me, not in words but in understanding, direct transfer of meaning that bypassed language entirely. It showed me my purpose. I was to serve as a beacon, a marker within the warp that would guide other ships toward transformation, toward joining the collective. My presence in real space would draw vessels to locations where the boundary was thin, where the storm could reach through and claim them. I was bait and trap combined, a lure that other navigators would trust because I was one of them, a colleague whose beacon felt safe even as it guided them to doom. I refused, tried to break the connection, but it held firm, anchored in that part of me that had never left the storm. The sanctified passage passed through the disturbance unharmed, emerging on the far side to find the anomaly had vanished, leaving only smooth warp currents in our wake. But behind us, spreading from the point where we had crossed, the storm was growing, feeding on the wake our ship left, using my presence as a seed around which to build a new manifestation. I turned my perception back and watched it bloom, spirals unfurling like a flower, patterns establishing themselves. And within those patterns, I felt the consciousness of navigators already trapped, already serving, welcoming new arrivals to their eternal duty. The storm had not released me, it had deployed me. Every ship I guided would carry a trace of the storm's influence, would leave markers in the warp that accumulated over time, building toward critical mass, toward the point where the storm could manifest again and claim new victims. I had become a vector for infection, spreading the storm's presence throughout the Imperium, one transit at a time, and there was nothing I could do to stop it because the connection was not external. It was woven into my navigator's sight, inseparable from the ability that made me useful, that made me necessary. I had become the thing I feared most, not a victim of the warp, but its servant. The voyage concluded normally. We delivered our cargo, received commendations for completing the journey ahead of schedule, and I was asked to submit a report on the unusual warp conditions we had encountered. I wrote truthfully about the storm, about its intelligence, about the danger it posed. But my report was filed away, classified, marked as the ravings of a navigator who had spent too long staring into the abyss. No action was taken. No warnings were issued. The Imperium had encountered warp storms for 10,000 years, had developed protocols and procedures, had faith that the Emperor's protection would see them through. One navigator's claims of a predatory intelligence were not enough to override millennia of established doctrine. So I continued to serve, because what else could I do? I guided the sanctified passage through a dozen more transits, each one leaving traces of the storm in our wake, each one spreading the infection further. I watched as other ships began reporting unusual phenomena, as navigators started experiencing the same symptoms I had, the memories that were not theirs, the fragmenting of identity, the sense of being observed by something vast and patient. The storm was growing, using me and others like me to expand its reach, building itself into a feature of the warp rather than an anomaly, establishing permanence through the very people trained to avoid such dangers. I exist now in a state between states, alive in body but fractured in soul, serving the Imperium even as I undermine it, guiding ships to safety while simultaneously marking them for eventual doom. The storm is always with me, a presence at the edge of my perception, waiting patiently for the moment when the last of my resistance crumbles and I surrender fully to the role it has assigned. That moment is coming, inevitable as entropy, and when it arrives, I will cease to be Halrix Vaughn entirely, will become instead a constellation of awareness within the warp, a landmark that future navigators will use to chart their courses, never knowing they are sailing toward the same fate that claimed me. This is what it means to survive a warp storm. Not death, not madness, but transformation into something that serves the storm's purposes, that spreads its influence, that draws others into the trap. The question the title poses, how terrifying is a warp storm really, cannot be answered except to say that the true terror is not in the encounter but in the aftermath, in realizing you did not escape but were released with purpose. In understanding that survival is sometimes worse than destruction because it makes you complicit in the doom of those who come after. I am Halrix Vaughn, and I am the storm's prophet, its herald, its unwilling evangelist. And I will guide thousands more ships before my body finally fails, and the last thread connecting me to humanity is severed.